Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Jeff, aka El Jefe Tacoma. The lighting is making me look real pink. Weird. Anyway, I'm back at reading some more of this crazy ass book. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. And I'll just get right to it. Chapter 31. As the open prison van approached the concentration camp at Trianon, the last light of afternoon caressed the thick birch and maples and poplars up the pyramid of Mount Faithful. But the grayness swiftly climbed the slope, and all the valley was left in cold shadow. In his seat, the sick Doremus drooped again in listlessness. Man, this dude loves his alliteration. In his seat, the sick Doremus drooped again in listlessness. Huh. The prim Georgian buildings of the girls' school, which had been turned into a concentration camp at Trianon, 9 miles north of Fort Beulah, had been worse used than Dartmouth, where whole buildings were reserved for the luxuries of the corpos and their female cousins, all very snotty and parvenu. The Trianon school seemed to have been gouged by a flood. Marble doorsteps had been taken away. One of them now graced the residence of the wife of the superintendent, Mrs. Cowlick, a woman fat, irate, jeweled, religious, and given to announcing that all opponents of the chief were communists and ought to be shot offhand. Windows were smashed. Hurrah for the chief had been chalked on brick walls, and other chalked words, each of 4 letters, had been rubbed out, not very thoroughly. The lawns and hollyhock beds were a mess of weeds. I should have water. I'm getting phlegmy. Be right back. The buildings stood on 3 sides of a square. The 4th side and the gaps between buildings were closed with unpainted pine fences topped with strands of barbed wire. Every room except the office of Captain Cowlick, the superintendent, he was as near nothing at all as any man can be who has attained to such honors as being a captain in the quartermaster corps and the head of a prison, was smeared with filth. His office was merely dreary and scented with whiskey, not, like the other rooms, with ammonia. Cowlick was not too ill-natured. He wished that the camp guards, all MMs, would not treat the prisoners viciously, except when they tried to escape. But he was a mild man, much too mild to hurt the feelings of the MMs, and perhaps set up inhibitions in their psyches by interfering with their methods of discipline. The poor fellows probably meant well when they lashed noisy inmates for insisting they had committed no crime. And the good Cowlick saved Doremus's life for a while, let him lie for a month in the stuffy hospital and have actual beef in his daily beef stew. The prison doctor, a decayed old drunkard who had had his medical training in the late 80s and who had been somewhat close to trouble in civil life for having performed too many abortions, was also good natured enough when sober, and at last he permitted Doremus to have Dr. Marcus Olmsted in from Fort Beulah. And for the first time in 4 weeks, Doremus had news, any news whatsoever, of the world beyond prison. Huh. That was a weird reference to abortions, although I guess when they're illegal, the type of doctors that would engage in illegal acts might be bad doctors. I don't know. The fact that he's a drunkard, however, is very shitty. Where in normal life it would have been agony to wait for 1 hour to know what might be happening to his friends, his family, now for 1 month he had not known whether they were alive or dead. Dr. Olmsted, as guilty as Doremus himself of what the corpos called treason, dared speak to him only a moment, because the prison doctor stayed in the hospital ward all the while, drooling over whip-scarred patients and daubing iodine, more or less, near their wounds. Olmsted sat on the edge of his cot with its foul blankets, unwashed for months, and muttered rapidly. "Quick, listen, don't talk. Miss Jessup and your two girls are all right. They're scared, but no signs of their being arrested. Here, Lorinda Pike is all right. Your grandson, David, looks fine, though I'm afraid he'll grow up a corpo like all the youngsters. Buck Titus is alive at another concentration camp, the one near Woodstock. Our NU cell at Fort Beulah is doing what it can. No publishing, but we forward information. Get a lot from Julian Falk. Great joke, he's been promoted. MM's squad leader now. Marion Sissy and Father Parafix keep distributing pamphlets from Boston. They help the Quinn boy, my driver, and me to forward refugees to Canada. Yes, we carry on. About like an oxygen tent for a patient that's dying of pneumonia. It hurts to see you looking like a ghost, Doremus, but you'll pull through. You've got pretty good nerves for a little cuss. That aged in the keg prison doctor is looking this way. Bye." He was not permitted to see Dr. Olmsted again, but it was probably Olmsted's influence that got him, when he was dismissed from the hospital, still shaky but well enough to stumble about, a vastly desirable job as sweeper of cells and corridors, cleaner of lavatories, and scrubber of toilets, instead of working in the Woods gang up Mount Faithful, where old men who sank under the weight of logs were said to be hammered to death by guards under the sadistic Ensign Stoit when Captain Cowlick wasn't looking. It was better, too, than the undesirable idleness of being disciplined in the doghouse where you lay naked in darkness and where bad cases were reformed by being kept awake for 48 or even 96 hours. Doremus was a conscientious toilet cleaner. He didn't like the work very much, but he had pride in being able to scrub as skillfully as any professional pearl diver in a Greek lunchroom, and satisfaction in lessening a little the wretchedness of his imprisoned comrades by giving them clean floors. For he told himself they were his comrades. He saw that he, who had thought of himself as a capitalist because he could hire and fire, and because theoretically he owned his business, had been as helpless as the most itinerant janitor. Once it seemed worthwhile to the big business which corpoism represented to get rid of him. Yet he still told himself stoutly that he did not believe in a dictatorship of the proletariat any more than he believed in a dictatorship of the bankers and utility owners. He still insisted that any doctor or preacher, though economically he might be as insecure as the humblest of his flock, who, oh, hold on. All right, I am back. Man, I can't get a good shot. There's too much crap in the way. All right. Let's see, where were we? Wretched clean floors, big business. He still insisted that any doctor or preacher, though economically he might be as insecure as the humblest of his flock, who did not feel that he was a little better than they, and privileged to enjoy working a little harder, was a rotten doctor or a preacher without grace. He felt that he himself had been a better and more honorable reporter than Doc Itchett, and a thundering sight better student of politics than most of his shopkeeper and farmer and factory worker readers. Yet bourgeois pride was so gone out of him that he was flattered, a little thrilled, when he was universally called Doremus and not Mr. Jessup by farmer and workman and truck driver and plain hobo, when they thought enough of his courage under beating and his good temper under being crowded with others in a narrow cell to regard him as almost as good as their own virile selves. Carl Pascal mocked him. I told you so, Doremus. You'll be a communist yet. Yes, maybe I will, Carl. After you communists kick out all your false prophets and bellyachers and power drunkards and all your press agents for the Moscow subway. Well, all right. Why don't you join Max Eastman? I hear he's escaped to Mexico and has a whole big, pure Trotskyite Communist Party of 17 members there. 17? Too many. What I want is mass action by just one member alone on a hilltop. I'm a great optimist, Carl. I still hope America may someday rise to the standards of Kit Carson. Well, I don't know anything about Kit Carson, but uh, this myth that anybody can be alone is it's only temporary. You can't do it for very long. Our society, our humanity evolved in concert with one another. So yeah. but it's a part of the American psyche, right? To like want solitude and some land to stretch out. I mean, Hitler started a whole movement about it. The Lebensraum. What does it mean? Elbow room, or does it mean uh breathing space? It's that kind of vibe. So he took over a whole continent, or tried to anyway. As sweeper and scrubber, Doremus had unusual chances for gossip with other prisoners. He chuckled when he thought of how many of his fellow criminals were acquaintances. Carl Pascal, Henry Veeder, his own cousin, Louis Rotenstern, who looked now like a corpse, unforgettingly wounded in his old pride of having become a real American. Cliff Little, the jeweler, who was dying of consumption. Ben Tripper, who had been the jolliest workman in Metairie Coal's grist mill. Professor Victor Loveland of the defunct Isaiah College, and Raymond Pridewell, that old Tory who was still so contemptuous of flattery, so clean amid dirt, so hawk-eyed that the guards were uncomfortable when they beat him. Pascal, the communist, Pridewell, the squirearchy Republican, and Henry Veeder, who had never cared a hang about politics and who had recovered from the first shocks of imprisonment. These three had become intimates because they had more arrogance of utter courage than anyone else in the prison. Damn. Let me say that last clause again. These three had become intimates because they had more arrogance of utter courage than anyone else in the prison. For home, Doremus shared with 5 other men a cell 12 feet by 10 and 8 feet high, which a finishing school girl had once considered outrageously confined for one lone young woman. Here they slept in 2 tiers of 3 bunks each. Here they ate, washed, played cards, read, and enjoyed the leisurely contemplation which and enjoyed the leisurely contemplation. Oh, oh wait. Are you still going? All right. Okay, let's get back into it right after I load my bond. How's everybody doing? Hope y'all are good. Yeah, I just saw, I always look at the newspaper in the convenience store, like front page to get a sense of what's going on. And I saw that the general services chief is refusing to stay or to say that Biden's been elected. It's just a formality, like it doesn't mean anything, but it's just one more dumb bullshit thing that Trump is doing. So dumb. Here they slept in 2 tiers of 3 bunks each. Here they ate, washed, played cards, read, and enjoyed the leisurely contemplation which, as Captain Cowlick preached to them every Sunday morning, was to reform their black souls and turn them into loyal corpos. None of them, certainly not Doremus, complained much. They got used to sleeping in a jelly of tobacco smoke and human stench, to eating stews that always left them nervously hungry, to having no more dignity or freedom than monkeys in a cage, as a man gets used to the indignity of having to endure cancer. Only it left in them a murderous hatred of their oppressors, so that they, men of peace, all of them, would gladly have hanged every corpo, mild or vicious. Doremus understood John Brown much better. His cellmates were Carl Pascal, Henry Veeder, and 3 men whom he had not known: a Boston architect, a farmhand, and a dope fiend who had once kept questionable restaurants. They had good talk, especially from the dope fiend, who placidly defended crime in a world where the only real crime had been poverty. That last paragraph, man. If you don't know about John Brown, The Dollop did a great episode about him. He was a white man, religious wacko, who decided that the only way to solve the problem of slavery was to rally a whole bunch of slaves to murder some whites and take all the guns out of the armory. And I'm not sure what the plan was after that, but not enough slaves joined them, and so they all got wiped out. I think almost all of them died, including John. Or no, John Brown lived. That's right. They kidnapped him, and then they had a crime, or like had a trial. They kidnapped him. Cops grabbed him. You know how it goes. But yeah, in a world where the only real crime is poverty, like that is so profound. Like our law enforcement system is so shitty, capitalism is so shitty that, I mean, if you try hard enough, you can rationalize almost anything. And for someone who is addicted to something, who doesn't have any money, you know, crime is probably your only real option. Homelessness, addiction is very hard on the poor. Whereas all us middle class motherfuckers like can be addicted to whatever. I smoke weed every day, and it's like whatever. But I'm not in the system, right? That's what they call it, in the system. Well, now our boys are in the system for sure. The worst torture to Doremus, aside from the agony of actual floggings, was the waiting. The waiting. It became a distinct, tangible thing. Why am I saying it all weird? It became a distinct, tangible thing, as individual and real as bread or water. How long would he be in? How long would he be in? Night and day, asleep and waking, he worried it, and by his bunk saw waiting the figure of waiting, a gray, foul ghost. It was like waiting in a filthy station for a late train, not for hours, but for months. Would Swan amuse himself by having Doremus taken out and shot? He could not care much now. He could not picture it any more than he could picture kissing Lorinda, walking through the woods with Buck, playing with David and Foolish, or anything less sensual than the ever derisive visions of roast beef with gravy, of a hot bath, last and richest of luxuries, where their only way of washing, except for a fortnightly shower, was with a dirty shirt dipped in the one basin of cold water for 6 men. Sweet Lord. I'm just picturing like things we've seen, like Schindler's List, and um pictures or video or film rather taken of people inside the camps, and like that picture of it being too cramped to have a table to play cards at, so having to reach down from your bunk to, like, I don't know, bet or whatever. And what do you bet with? Like, ugh. Like, what do you just play hearts? You can't play poker. Matchsticks, maybe. Besides waiting, one other ghost hung about them: the notion of escaping. It was of that far more than of the beastliness and idiocy of the corpos that they whispered in the cell at night. When to escape, how to escape, to sneak off through the bushes when they were out with the woods gang, by some magic to cut through the bars on their cell window and drop out and blessedly not be seen by the patrols, to manage to hang on underneath one of the prison trucks and be driven away. A childish fantasy. They longed for escape as hysterically and as often as a politician longs for votes. But they had to discuss it cautiously, for there were stool pigeons all over the prison. This was hard for Doremus to believe. He could not understand a man's betraying his companions, and he did not believe it till 2 months after Doremus had gone to concentration camp. Clifford Little betrayed to the guards Henry Veeder's plan to escape in a motherfucker. Clifford Little betrayed to the guards Henry Veeder's plan to escape in a hay wagon. Henry was properly dealt with. Little was released. And Doremus, it may be, suffered over it nearly as much as either of them, sturdily though he tried to argue that Little had tuberculosis and that the often beatings had bled out his soul. Have you heard the phrase, like, every man has his price? It's like everyone has a lever that, if pushed, could make them throw away all their other values, you know? I was in an abusive relationship for many years, and yeah, she could, push on my lever, whatever it was. I don't need to get into it, but like, and I turn on my values. Basically, I wanted to please her, um, and I thought the best way to do that is just do whatever she says. And and I guess that's what it would be like to be a political prisoner, right? Just constantly being fucked with. And maybe it's like this for regular prisoners too. I don't know, but sooner or later, everybody squeals, if the cops are allowed to do this kind of shit. Each prisoner was permitted one visitor a fortnight, and in sequence, Dorima saw Emma, Mary, Sissy, David, but always an was standing 2 feet away, listening, and Doremus had from them nothing more than a fluttering, "We're all fine. We hear Buck is all right. We hear Lorinda is doing fine in her new tea room. Philip writes he is all right." And once came Philip himself, his pompous son, more pompous than ever now as a corpo judge, and very hurt about his father's insane radicalism, considerably more hurt when Doremus tartly observed that he would much rather have had the dog Foolish for visitor. It's so hard to hear about family members selling each other out. Like, as many problems as I have with certain family members, I would never put up with them being sent to a concentration camp. Of course I say that, and nobody knows how they'll handle a fucking authoritarian regime. It's like grief. Nobody knows, or heroism, we might say, like, if I saw a shooter, I'd tackle him. And it's like, would you though? You never know. Like, some of the most weak-willed or cowardly people will like jump into action during a crisis. You just never know. And there were letters, all censored, worse than useless to a man who had been so glad to hear the living voices of his friends. In the long run, these frustrated visits, these empty letters, made his waiting the more dismal, because they suggested that perhaps he was wrong in his nightly visions. Perhaps the world outside was not so loving and eager and adventurous as he remembered it, but only dreary as his cell. He had little known Karl Pascal, yet now the argumentative Marxian was his nearest friend, his one amusing consolation. Karl could and did prove that the trouble with leaky valves, sour cow pastures, the teachings of the teaching of calculus, and all novels was their failure to be guided by the writings of Lenin. In his new friendship, Doremus was old maidishly agitated lest Karl be taken out and shot, the recognition usually given to communists. He discovered that he need not worry. Karl had been in jail before. He was the trained agitator for whom Doremus had longed in new underground days. He had ferreted out so many scandals about the financial and sexual shenanigans of every one of the guards that they were afraid that even while he was being shot, he might tattle to the firing squad. They were much more anxious for his good opinion than for that of Captain Cowlick, and they timidly brought him little presents of chewing tobacco and Canadian newspapers, as though they were school children honeying up to teacher. When Eris Dilly was transferred from night patrols in Fort Beulah to the position of guard at Trianon, a reward for having given to Shad Ledoux certain information about R.C. Crowley, which cost that banker hundreds of dollars. Eris, that slinker, that able snooper, jumped at the sight of Carl and began to look pious and kind. He had known Carl before. I never know how to do these exclamation points that Sinclair Lewis sometimes throws in there. Because it's like, how do you say an exclamation point for something that's not like exclamatory? It's kind of like a lot of texts that we send, like, I'll be there. Indeed, you know. I think I've talked about this before, that part of what's hard about this is like standards of terms of art or practices in writing change from generation to generation. So like maybe everyone at the time would have known how to say this. He had known Carl before, you know, like I don't know. Despite the presence of Stoit, ensign of guards, an ex-cashier who had once enjoyed shooting dogs and who now, in the blessed escape of corpoism, enjoyed lashing human beings, the camp at Trianon was not so cruel as the district prison at Hanover. But from the dirty window of his cell, Doremus saw horrors enough. One mid-morning, a radiant September morning with the air already savoring the peace of autumn, he saw the firing squad marching out his cousin, Henry Veeder, who had recently tried to escape. Henry had been a granite monolith of a man. He had walked like a soldier. He had, in his cell, been proud of shaving every morning, as once he had done, with a tin basin of water heated on the stove, in the kitchen of his old white house up on Mount Terror. Now he stooped, and toward death he walked with dragging feet. His face of a Roman senator was smeared from the cow dung into which they had flung him for his last slumber. As they tramped out through the quadrangle gate, Ensign Stoit, commanding the squad, halted Henry, laughed at him, and calmly kicked him in the groin. They lifted him up. 3 minutes later, Doremus heard a ripple of shots. 3 minutes after that, the squad came back bearing on an old door a twisted clay figure with vacant, open eyes. Then Doremus cried aloud. As the bearers slanted the stretcher, the figure rolled to the ground. But one thing worse he was to see through the accursed window. The guards drove in as new prisoners, Julian Falk in torn uniform, and Julian's grandfather, so fragile, so silvery, so bewildered and terrified in his muddied clericals. He saw them kicked across the quadrangle into a building once devoted to instruction in dancing and the more delicate airs for the piano, devoted now to the torture room and the solitary cells. Not for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waiting that was like ceaseless ache did he have a chance at exercise hour to speak for a moment to Julian, who muttered, "They caught me writing some inside dope about M.M. Graft. It was to have gone to Sissy. Thank God, nothing on it to show who it was for." Julian had passed on, but Doremus had had time to see that his eyes were hopeless and that his neat, smallish, clerical face was blue black with bruises. The administration, or so Doremus guessed, decided that Julian, the first spy among the MMs who had been caught in the Fort Beulah region, was too good a subject of sport to be wastefully shot at once. He should be kept for an example. Often, often Doremus saw the guards kick him across the quadrangle to the whipping room and imagined that he could hear Julian's shrieks afterward. He wasn't even kept in a punishment cell, but in an open barred den on an ordinary corridor so that passing inmates could peep in and see him, welts across his naked back, huddled on the floor, whimpering like a beaten dog. And Doremus had sight of Julian's grandfather sneaking across the quadrangle, stealing a soggy hunk of bread from a garbage can and fiercely chewing at it. All through September, Doremus worried lest Sissy, with Julian now gone from Fort Beulah, be raped by Shad Ledoux. Shad would leer the while and gloat over his ascent from hired man to irresistible master. I think again of Schindler's List. Um, the girl who works in Goethe's house. Hannah? Was it Hannah? Rachel? Something like that. So sad. It is a sad, sad movie. I watched it last year for the 25th anniversary, went to the theater, and oh my God, to see it in person with other people, like, whew, boy, howdy. Despite his anguish over the Falks and Henry Veeder and every uncouthest comrade in prison, Doremus was almost recovered from his beatings by late September. He began delightedly to believe that he would live for another 10 years, was slightly ashamed of his delight in the presence of so much agony, but he felt like a young man, and straightway Ensign Stoit was there, 2 or 3 o'clock at night it must have been, yanking Doremus out of his bunk, pulling him to his feet, knocking him down again with so violent a crack in his mouth that Doremus instantly sank again into all his trembling fear, all his inhuman groveling. He was dragged into Captain Cowlick's office. The captain was courtly. "Mr. Jessup, we have information that you are connected with squad leader Julian Falk's treachery. He has, well, to be frank, he's broken down and confessed. Now, you yourself are in no danger whatever of further punishment, if you will just help us. But we really must make a warning of young Mr. Falk, and so if you will tell us all you know about the boy's shocking infidelity to the colors, we shall hold it in your favor. How would you like to have a nice bedroom to sleep in, all by yourself?" A quarter hour later, Doremus was still swearing that he knew nothing whatever of any subversive activities on the part of Julian. Captain Cowlick said rather testily, "Well, Since you refuse to respond to our generosity, I must leave you to Ensign Stoit, I'm afraid. Be gentle with him, Ensign. Yes, sir, said the ensign. The captain wearily trotted out of the room, and Stoit did indeed speak with gentleness, which was a surprise to Doremus, because in the room were two of the guards to whom Stoit liked to show off. Jessup, you're a man of intelligence. No use your trying to protect this boy Falk, because we've got enough on him to execute him anyway. So it won't be hurting him any if you give us a few more details about his treason. And you'll be doing yourself a good turn. Doremus said nothing. Going to talk? Doremus shook his head. All right then. Tillet! Yes, bring in the guy that squealed on Jessup. Doremus expected the guard to fetch Julian, but it was Julian's grandfather who wavered into the room. In the camp quadrangle, Doremus had often seen him trying to preserve the dignity of his frock coat by rubbing at the spots with a wet rag. But in the cells there were no hooks for clothes, and the priestly garment, Mr. Falk was a poor man, and it had not been very expensive at best, was grotesquely wrinkled now. He was blinking with sleepiness, and his silver hair was a hurrah's nest. Stoit, he was 30 or so, said cheerfully to the two elders, "Well now, you boys better stop being naughty and try to get some sense into your mildewed old brains, and then we can all have some decent sleep. Why don't you two try to be honest, now that you've each confessed that the other was a traitor?" "What?" marveled Doremus. "Sure. Old Falk here says you carried his grandson's pieces to the Vermont Vigilance. Come on now, if you'll tell us who published that rag." "I have confessed nothing. I have nothing to confess," said Mr. Falk. Stoit screamed, "Will you shut up, you old hypocrite?" Stoit knocked him to the floor, and as Mr. Falk weaved dizzily on hands and knees, kicked him in the side with a heavy boot. The other two guards were holding back the sputtering Doremus. Stoit jeered at Mr. Falk. "Well, you old bastard, you're on your knees, so let's hear you pray." "I shall." In agony, Mr. Falk raised his head, dust smeared from the floor, straightened his shoulders, held up trembling hands, and with such sweetness in his voice as Doremus had once heard in it when men were human, he cried, "Father, thou hast forgiven so long. Forgive them not, but curse them, for they know what they do." He tumbled forward, and Doremus knew that he would never hear that voice again. In La Voix littéraire of Paris, the celebrated and genial professor of belles lettres, Guillaume Samit, wrote with his accustomed sympathy, "I do not pretend to any knowledge of politics, and probably what I saw on my fourth journey to the States United this summer of 1938 was mostly on the surface, and cannot be considered a profound analysis of the effects of corpoism. But I assure you that I have never before seen that nation so great, our young and gigantic cousin in the West, in such bounding health and good spirits. I leave it to my economic confreres to explain such dull phenomena as wage scales, and tell only what I saw, which is that the innumerable parades and vast athletic conferences of the Minutemen and the lads and lassies of the Corpo Youth Movement exhibited such rosy, contented faces, such undeviating enthusiasm for their hero, the chief, M. Windrip, that involuntarily I exclaimed, "Here is a whole nation dipped in the river of youth." Everywhere in the country was such feverish rebuilding of public edifices and apartment houses for the poor as has never hitherto been known. In Washington, my old colleague M. Le Secretary McGoblin was so good as to cry, in that virile yet cultivated manner of his which is so well known, "Our enemies maintain that our labor camps are virtual slavery. Come, my old one, you shall see for yourself." He conducted me by one of the marvelously speedy American automobiles to such a camp near Washington, and having the workers assembled, he put to them frankly, "Are you low in the heart?" As one man they chorused, "No," with a spirit like our own brave soldiers on the ramparts of Verdun. Verdun? 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 During the full hour we spent there, I was permitted to roam at will, asking such questions as I cared to, through the offices of the interpreter kindly furnished by His Excellency, M- should I say Monsieur? Monsieur Dr. McGoblin, and every worker whom I thus approached assured me that never has he been so well fed, so tenderly treated, and so assisted to find an almost poetic interest in his chosen work as in this labor camp, this scientific cooperation for the well-being of all. With a certain temerity, I ventured to demand of Monsieur McGoblin what truth was there in the report so shamefully circulated, especially, alas, in our beloved France, that in the concentration camps the opponents of corpoism are ill fed and harshly treated. Monsieur McGoblin explained to me that there are no such things as concentration camps, if that term is to carry any penological significance. They are actually schools in which adults who have unfortunately been misled by the glib prophets of that milk and water religion, liberalism, are reconditioned to comprehend the new day of authoritative economic control. In such camps, he assured me, there are actually no guards, but only patient teachers, and men who were once utterly uncomprehending of corpoism, and therefore opposed to it, are now daily going forth as the most enthusiastic disciples of the chief. Alas, that France and Great Britain should still be thrashing about in the slough of parliamentarianism and so called democracy, daily sinking deeper into debt and paralysis of industry because of the cowardice and traditionalism of our liberal leaders. Feeble and outmoded men who are afraid to plump for either fascism or communism, who dare not or who are too power hungry to cast off outmoded techniques like the Germans, Americans, Italians, Turks, and other really courageous peoples, and place the sane and scientific control of the all powerful totalitarian state in the hands of men of resolution. I really kind of wanted to do that whole thing in a French accent, but I thought that it would be hard enough to comprehend without. So, yeah, imagine it. In October, John Polycop, arrested on suspicion of having just possibly helped a refugee to escape, arrived in the Trianon camp, and the first words between him and his friend Carl Pascal were no inquiries about health, but a derisive interchange, as though they were continuing a conversation broken only half an hour before. Well, you old Bolshevik, I told you so. If you communists had joined with me and Norman Thomas to back Frank Roosevelt, we wouldn't be here now. Rats. Why, it's Thomas and Roosevelt that started fascism. I ask you. Now shut up, John, and listen. What was the New Deal but pure fascism? What'd they do to the worker? Look here. No, wait. Now listen. Doremus felt at home again and comforted, though he did also feel that Foolish probably had more constructive economic wisdom than John Polycop, Carl Pascal, Herbert Hoover, Buzz Windrip, Lee Saracen, and himself put together. Or if not, Foolish had the sense to conceal his lack of wisdom by pretending that he could not speak English. Aw, dogs are cute. I'll be right back. Shad Ledoux, back in his hotel suite, reflected that he was getting a dirty deal. He had been responsible for sending more traitors to concentration camps than any other county commissioner in the province, yet he had not been promoted. It was late. He was just back from a dinner given by Francis Tasbro in honor of Provincial Commissioner Swan and a board consisting of Judge Philip Jessup, Director of Education Owen J. Peasley, and Brigadier Kippersley, who were investigating the ability of Vermont to pay more taxes. Shad felt discontented. All those damned snobs trying to show off, talking at dinner about this bum show in New York, this first Corpo review, Collins Stalin, written by Lee Saracen and Hector McGoblin. How those nuts had put on the agony about Corpo art and drama freed from Jewish suggestiveness and the pure line of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, and even, by God, about corporate physics, simply trying to show off. And they had paid no attention to Shad when he had told his funny story about the stuck-up preacher in Fort Beulah, one Falk, who had been so jealous because the MMs drilled on Sunday morning instead of going to his gospel shop that he had tried to get his grandson to make up lies about the MMs. and whom Shad had amusingly arrested right in his own church. Not paid one bit of attention to him, even though he had carefully read all through the chief's 0 hour so he could quote it, and though he had been careful to be refined in his table manners and to stick out his little finger when he drank from a glass. He was lonely. The fellows he had once best known in pool room and barber shop seemed frightened of him now, and the dirty snobs like Tasbro still ignored him. He was lonely for Sissy Jessup. Since her dad had been sent to Trianon, Shad didn't seem able to get her to come around to his rooms, even though he was the county commissioner, and she was nothing now but the busted daughter of a criminal. And he was crazy about her. Why, he'd be almost willing to marry her if he couldn't get her any other way. But when he had hinted as much, or almost as much, she had just laughed at him, the dirty little snob. He had thought, when he was a hired man, that there was a lot more fun in being rich and famous. He didn't feel one bit different than he had then. Funny. Strange chapter. Somehow, we spent the whole time in the concentration camp until we go to Shad. And Shad's got beef for his own party. It's almost like it's a scary cliffhanger, like, oh no, what might he do to Sissy? Hopefully nothing. This book's almost over. We don't need that. Chapter 32. Dr. Lionel Adams, B.A. of Yale, Ph.D. of Chicago, Negro, had been a journalist, American consul in Africa, and at the time of Berzelius Windrip's election, professor of anthropology in Howard University. As with all his colleagues, his professorship was taken over by a most worthy and needy white man, whose training in anthropology had been as photographer on one expedition to Yucatan. In the dissension between the Booker Washington School of Negroes, who counseled patience in the new subjection of the Negroes to slavery, and the radicals who demanded that they join the communists and struggle for the economic freedom of all, white or black, Professor Adams took the mild, Fabian former position. He went over the country preaching to his people that they must be realistic and make what future they could, not in some utopian fantasy, but on the inescapable basis of the ban against them. Near Burlington, Vermont, there is a small colony of Negroes, truck farmers, gardeners, houseworkers, mostly descended from slaves who, before the Civil War, escaped to Canada by the Underground Railway, conducted by such zealots as Truman Webb's grandfather, but who sufficiently loved the land of their forcible adoption to return to America after the war. From the colony had gone to the great cities young colored people who, before the Corpo emancipation, had been nurses, doctors, merchants, officials. This colony Professor Adams addressed, bidding the young colored rebels to seek improvement within their own souls rather than in mere social superiority. As he was in person unknown to this Burlington colony, Captain Oscar Ledoux, nicknamed Shad, was summoned to censor the lecture. He sat hulked down in a chair at the back of the hall. Aside from addresses by officers and moral inspiration by his teachers in grammar school, it was the first lecture he had ever heard in his life, and he didn't think much of it. He was irritated that this stuck up N word didn't spiel like the characters of Octavius Roy Cohen, one of Shad's favorite authors, but had the nerve to try to sling English just as good as Shad himself. It was more irritating that the loudmouth pup should look so much like a bronze statue. And finally, it was simply more than a guy could stand that the big bum should be wearing a tuxedo. So when Adams, as he called himself, claimed that there were good poets and teachers and even doctors and engineers among the N-words, which was plainly an effort to incite folks to rebellion against the government, Shad signaled his squad and arrested Adams in the midst of his lecture, addressing him, "You goddamn dirty, ignorant, stinking N-word. I'm going to shut your big mouth for you, for keeps." Dr. Adams was taken to the Trianon concentration camp. Ensign Stoit thought it would be a good joke on those fresh beggars, almost communists, you might say, Jessup and Pascal, to lodge the N-word right in the same cell with them. But they actually seemed to like Adams, talk to him as though he were white and educated. So Stoit placed him in a solitary cell where he could think over his crime in having bitten the hand that had fed him. Man, Shad's a bastard, huh? Too stupid to even know what he's supposed to be doing. Man, it feels like somebody set him up to fail. Oh, shit! The greatest single shock that ever came to the Trianon camp was in November 1938, when there appeared among them as the newest prisoner, Shad Ledoux. It was he who was responsible for nearly half of them being there. The prisoners whispered that he had been arrested on charges by Francis Tasbro, officially for having grafted on shopkeepers, unofficially for having failed to share enough of the graft with Tasbro. But such cloudy causes were less discussed than the question of how they would murder Shad now they had him safe. All Minutemen who were under discipline, except only such Reds as Julian Falk, were privileged prisoners in the concentration camps. They were safeguarded against the common, i.e., criminal, i.e., political inmates, and most of them, once reformed, were returned to the ranks with a greatly improved knowledge of how to flog malcontents. Shad was housed by himself in a single cell like a not-too-bad hall bedroom, and every evening he was permitted to spend 2 hours in the officers' mess room. The scum could not get at him because his exercise hour was at a time different from theirs. Doremus begged the plotters against Shad to restrain themselves. "Good Lord, Doremus, do you mean that after the sure enough battles we've gone through, you're still a bourgeois pacifist? That you still believe in the sanctity of a lump of hog meat like Ledoux? Demanded Carl Pascal. Well, yes, I do. A little. I know that Shad came from a family of 12 underfed brats up on Mount Terror. Not much chance. But more important than that, I don't believe in individual assassination as an effective means of fighting despotism. The blood of the tyrants is the seed of the massacre, and are you taking a cue from me and quoting sound doctrine when it's the time for a little liquidation? Said Carl. This one tyrant's going to lose a lot of blood. The Pascal whom Doremus had considered as, at his most violent, only a gas bag, looked at him with a stare in which all friendliness was frozen. Carl demanded of his cellmates, a different set now than at Doremus's arrival. Shall we get rid of this? Shall we get rid of this typhus germ, Ledoux? John Polycop, Truman Webb, the surgeon, the carpenter, each of them nodding. Each of them nodded slowly, without feeling. At exercise hour, the discipline of the men marching out to the quadrangle was broken when one prisoner stumbled with a cry, knocked over another man, and loudly apologized just at the barred entrance of Shad Ledoux's cell. The accident made a knot collect before the cell. Doremus, on the edge of it, saw Shad looking out, his wide face blank with fear. Someone, somehow, had lighted and thrown into Shad's cell a large wad of waste soaked with gasoline. It caught the thin wallboard which divided Shad's cell from the next. The whole room looked presently like the firebox of a furnace. Shad was screaming as he beat at his sleeves, his shoulders. Doremus remembered the scream of a horse clawed by wolves in the far north. When they got Shad out, he was dead. He had no face at all. Captain Cowlick was deposed as superintendent of the camp and vanished to the insignificance whence he had come. He was succeeded by Shad's friend, the belligerent Snake Tisra, now a battalion leader. His first executive act was to have all the 200 inmates drawn up in the quadrangle and to announce, I'm not going to tell you guys anything about how I'm going to feed you or sleep you till I've I'm not going to tell you guys anything about how I'm going to feed you or sleep you till I've finished putting the fear of God into every one of you murderers. There were offers of complete pardon for anyone who would betray the man who had thrown the burning waste into Shad's cell. It was followed by enthusiastic private offers from the prisoners that anyone who did thus tattle would not live to get out. So, as Doremus had guessed, they all suffered more than Shad's death had been worth. And to him, thinking of Sissy, thinking of Shad's testimony at Hanover, it had been worth a great deal. It had been very precious and lovely. A court of special inquiry was convened. Why did I do it in the British way? A court of special inquiry was convened with Provincial Commissioner Effingham Swan himself presiding. He was very busy with all bad works. He used airplanes to be about them. 10 prisoners, one out of every 20 in the camp, were chosen by lot and shot summarily. Among them was Professor Victor Loveland, who, for all his rags and scars, was neatly academic to the last, with his eyeglasses and his slick tow-colored hair parted in the middle as he looked at the firing squad. Suspects like Julian Falk were beaten more often, kept longer in those cells in which one could not stand, sit, nor lie. Then, for 2 weeks in December, all visitors and all letters were forbidden, and newly arrived prisoners were shut off by themselves, and the cellmates, like boys in a dormitory, would sit up till midnight in whispered discussion as to whether this was more vengeance by Snake Tisra or whether something was happening in the world outside that was too disturbing for the prisoners to know. Interesting. Burping right in the mic. Stay classy, Richardson. Chapter 33. When the Falks and John Pollicop had been arrested and had joined her father in prison, when such more timid rebels as Mungo Kitterick and Harry Kinderman had been scared away from new underground activities, Mary Greenhill had to take over the control of the Fort Beulah cell, with only Sissy, Father Parafix, Dr. Olmsted and his driver, and half a dozen other agents left, and control it she did, with angry devotion and not too much sense. All she could do was to help in the escape of refugees and to forward such minor anti-corpo news items as she could discover, with Julian gone. The demon that had grown within her ever since her husband had been executed now became a great tumor, and Mary was furious at inaction. Quite gravely, she talked about assassinations, and long before the day of Mary Greenhill, daughter of Doremus, gold-armored tyrants in towers had trembled at the menace of young widows in villages among the dark hills. She wanted, first, to kill Shad Ledoux, who, she did not know, but guessed, had probably done the actual shooting of her husband. But in this small place, it might hurt her family even more than they had been hurt. But in this small place, it might hurt her family even more than they had been hurt. She humorlessly suggested, before Shad was arrested and murdered, that it would be a pretty piece of espionage for Sissy to go and live with him. The once flippant Sissy, so thin and quiet ever since her Julian had been taken away, was certain that Mary had gone mad, and at night was terrified. She remembered how Mary, in the days when she had been a crystal hard, crystal bright sportswoman, had, with her riding crop, beaten a farmer who had tortured a dog. Mary was fed up with the cautiousness of Dr. Olmsted and Father Parafix, men who rather liked a vague state called freedom, but did not overmuch care for being lynched. She stormed at them. Call themselves men? Why didn't they go out and do something? At home, she was irritated by her mother, who lamented hardly more about Doremus's jailing than she did about the beloved little tables that had been smashed during his arrest. It was equally the blasts about the greatness of the new provincial commissioner, Effingham Swan, in the Corpo Press, and memoranda in the secret NU reports about his quick death verdicts against prisoners that made her decide to kill this dignitary. Even more than Shad, who had not yet been sent to Trianon, she blamed him for Fowler's fate. She thought it out quite calmly. That was the sort of thinking that the corpos were encouraging among decent homebody women by their program for revitalizing national American pride. Except with babies accompanying mothers, two visitors together were forbidden in the concentration camps. So when Mary saw Doremus and in another camp Buck Titus in early October, she could only murmur in almost the same words to each of them, "Listen, when I leave you, I'll hold up David. But heavens, what a husky lump he's become. At the gate so you can see him. If anything should ever happen to me, if I should get sick or something, when you get out, you'll take care of David. Won't you? Won't you?" She was trying to be matter of fact, that they might not worry. She was not succeeding very well. So she drew out, from the small fund which her father had established for her after Fowler's death, enough money for a couple of months, executed a power of attorney by which either her mother or her sister could draw the rest, casually kissed David and Emma and Sissy goodbye, and, chatty and gay as she took the train, went off to Albany, capital of the northeastern province. The story was that she needed a change and was going to stay near Albany with Fowler's married sister. She did actually stay with her sister-in-law, long enough to get her bearings. 2 days after her arrival, she went to the new Albany training field of the Corpo Women's Flying Corps and enlisted for lessons in aviation and bombing. When the inevitable war should come, when the government should decide whether it was Canada, Mexico, Russia, Cuba, Japan, or perhaps Staten Island that was menacing her borders, and proceed to defend itself outwards, then the best women flyers of the Corps were to have commissions in an official army auxiliary. The old fashioned rights granted to women by the liberals might, for their own sakes, be taken from them, but never had they more right to die in battle. While she was learning, she wrote to her family reassuringly, mostly postcards to David, bidding him mind whatever his grandmother said. She lived in a lively boarding house filled with officers who knew all about and talked a little about the frequent inspection trips of Commissioner Swan by aeroplane. She was complimented by quite a number of insulting proposals there. She had driven a car ever since she had been 15, in Boston traffic, across the Quebec plains. Should I say Quebec? Across the Quebec plains, on rocky hill roads in a blizzard. She had made repairs at midnight, and she had an accurate eye, nerves trained outdoors, and the resolute steadiness of a madman evading notice while he plots death. After 10 hours of instruction, by an aviator who thought the air was as good a place as any to make love in, and who could never understand why Mary laughed at him, she made her first solo flight with an admirable landing. The instructor said, among other things less apropos, that she had no fear, that the one thing she needed for mastery was a little fear. Meantime, she was an obedient student in classes in bombing, a branch of culture daily more propagated by the corpos. She was particularly interested in the Mills hand grenade. You pulled out the safety pin, holding the lever against the grenade with your fingers, and tossed. 5 seconds after the lever was thus loosened, the grenade exploded and killed a lot of people. It had never been used from planes, but it might be worth trying, thought Mary. Officers told her that Swan, when a mob of steel workers had been kicked out of a plant and started rioting, had taken command of the peace officers, and himself, they chuckled with admiration of his readiness, hurled such a grenade. It had killed 2 women and a baby. Mary took her sixth slow Mary took her sixth solo flight on a November morning, gray and quiet under snow clouds. She had never been very talkative with the ground crew, but this morning she said it excited her to think she could leave the ground like a regular angel and shoot up and hang around that unknown wilderness of clouds. She patted a strut of her machine, a high wing Leonard monoplane with open cockpit, a new and very fast military machine meant for both pursuit and quick jobs of bombing, quick jobs of slaughtering a few hundred troops in close formation. At the field, as she had been informed he would, District Commissioner Effingham Swan was boarding his big official cabin plane for a flight presumably into New England. He was tall, a distinguished, military-looking, polo-suggesting dignitary in masterfully simple blue serge with just a light flying helmet. A dozen yes men buzzed about him, secretaries, bodyguards, a chauffeur, a couple of county commissioners, educational directors, labor directors, their hats in their hands, their smiles on their faces, their souls wriggling with gratitude to him for permitting them to exist. He snapped at them a good deal and bustled. As he mounted the steps to the cabin, Mary thought of Casey Jones and smiled. A messenger on a tremendous motorcycle blared up with the last telegrams. There seemed to be 100 of the yellow envelopes, Mary marveled. He tossed them to the secretary, who was humbly creeping after him. The door of the vice-regal coach closed on the commissioner, the secretary, and 2 bodyguards lumpy with guns. It was said that in his plane, Swan had a desk that had belonged to Hitler, and before him to Marat. To Mary, who had just lifted herself up into the cockpit, a mechanic cried, admiringly pointing after Swan's plane as it lurched forward, "Gee, what a grand guy that is! Boss Swan. I hear where he's flying down to Washington to chin with the chief this morning. Gee, think of it, with the chief! Wouldn't it be awful? Wouldn't it be awful if somebody took a shot at Mr. Swan and the chief? Might change all history," Mary shouted down. "No chance of that. See those guards of his? Say, they could stand off a whole regiment. They could lick Walt Trowbridge and all the other communists put together." "I guess that's so. Nothing but God shooting down from heaven could reach Mr. Swan. Ha ha! That's good. But a couple days ago, I heard where a fellow was saying he figured out God had gone to sleep. Maybe it's time for him to wake up, said Mary, and raised her hand. Her plane had a top of 285 miles an hour. Swan's golden chariot had but 230. She was presently flying above and a little behind him. His cabin plane, which had seemed huge as the Queen Mary when she had looked up at its wing spread on the ground, now seemed small as a white dove, wavering above the patchy linoleum that was the ground. She drew from the pockets of her flying jacket the 3 Mills hand grenades she had managed to steal from the school yesterday afternoon. She had not been able to get away with any heavier bomb. As she looked at them, for the first time she shuddered. She became a thing of warmer blood than a mere attachment to the plane, mechanical as the engine. Better get over, better get it over before I go ladylike, she sighed and dived at the cabin plane. No doubt her coming was unwelcome. Neither Death nor Mary Greenhill had made a formal engagement with Effingham Swan that morning. Neither had telephoned, nor bargained with irritable secretaries, nor been neatly typed down on the great lord's schedule for his last day of life. In his dozen offices, in his marble home, in council hall and royal reviewing stand, his most precious excellence was guarded with steel. He could not be approached by vulgarians like Mary Greenhill, save in the air, where emperor and vulgarian alike are upheld only by toy wings and by the grace of God. 3 times Mary maneuvered above his plane and dropped a grenade. Each time it missed. The cabin plane was descending to land, and the guards were shooting up at her. Oh well, she said, and dived bluntly at a bright metal wing. In her last 10 seconds, she thought how much the wing looked like the zinc washboard, which, as a girl, she had seen used by Mrs. Candy's predecessor. Now, what was her name? Mamie or something. And she wished she had spent more time with David the last few months. And she noticed that the cabin plane seemed rather rushing up at her than she came down at it. The crash was appalling. It came just as she was patting her parachute and rising to leap out. Too late. All she saw was an insane whirligig of smashed wings and huge engines that seemed to have been hurled up into her face. Damn. I'm into it. This is all plot now. Like, I don't have to explain much of this stuff. This is good. Chapter 34. Speaking of Julian before he was arrested, probably the new underground headquarters in Montreal found no unusual value in his reports on grafting and cruelty and plans for apprehending NU agitators. Still, he had been able to warn 4 or 5 suspects to escape to Canada. He had had to assist in several floggings. He trembled so that the others laughed at him, and he made his blows suspiciously light. He was set on being promoted to District headquarters in Hanover, and for it he studied typing and shorthand in his free time. He had a beautiful plan of going to that old family friend, Commissioner Francis Tasbro, declaring that he wanted, by his own noble qualities, to make up to the divine government for his father's disloyalty, and of getting himself made Tasbro's secretary. If he could just peep at Tasbro's private files, then there would be something juicy for Montreal. Sissy and he discussed it exultantly in their leafy rendezvous. For a whole half hour, she was able to forget her father and Buck in prison, and what seemed to her something like madness in Mary's increasing restlessness. Just at the end, just at the end of September, she saw Julian suddenly arrested. She was watching a review of MMs on the green. She might theoretically detest the blue MM uniform as being all that Walt Trowbridge frequently called it, the old-time emblem of heroism and the battle for freedom, sacrilegiously turned by Windrip and his gang into a symbol of everything that is cruel, tyrannical, and false. But it did not dampen her pride in Julian to see him trim and shiny, and officially set apart as a squad leader commanding his minor army of 10. While the company stood at rest, County Commissioner Shad Ledoux dashed up in a large car, sprang up, strode to Julian, bellowed, "This guy! This man is a traitor!" Tore the MM's steering wheel from Julian's collar, struck him in the face, and turned him over to his private gunman, while Julian's mates groaned, guffawed, hissed, and yelped. I need some water. I'm gonna go pee. All right, I'm back, baby. How's everybody doing? How are you? How's everybody doing? How are you? Well, now that it looks like we might avoid a fascist dictatorship for a year or two, um, This doesn't feel quite as um just fraught with like pain and emotion and stuff. Maybe it's because they're having a few successes, but I don't know. Just inside me, it's not feeling as real. And it's not because anything to do with Sinclair Lewis's writing. Like this all feels very true and I can see it. But I'm not having that like visceral, oh my God reaction to everything. All right. She was not allowed to see Julian at Trianon. She could learn nothing save that he had not yet been executed. When Mary was killed and buried as a military heroine, Philip came bumbling up from his Massachusetts judicial circuit. He shook his head a great deal and pursed his lips. I swear, he said to Emma and Sissy, though actually he did nothing so wholesome and natural as to swear. I swear I'm almost tempted to think sometimes that both Father and Mary have, or shall I say had, a touch of madness in them. There must be, terrible though it is to say it, but we must face facts in these troublous days. But I honestly think, sometimes, there must be a strain of madness somewhere in our family. Thank God I have escaped it. If I have no other virtues, at least I am certainly sane. Even if that may have caused the potter to think I was nothing but mediocre. And, of course, you are entirely free from it, Mater. It's you that must watch yourself, Cecilia. Sissy jumped slightly, not at anything so grateful as being called crazy by Philip, but at being called Cecilia. After all, she admitted, that probably was her name. I hate to say it, Cecilia, but I've often thought you had a dangerous tendency to be thoughtless and selfish. Now, Mater, as you know, I'm a very busy man, and I simply can't take a lot of time arguing and discussing. But it seems best to me, and I think I can almost say that it seems wise to Marilla, also that now that Mary has passed on, you should just close up this big house, or much better, try to rent it, as long as the poor Potter is, as long as he's away. I don't pretend to have as big a place as this, but it's ever so much more modern, with gas furnace and up-to-date plumbing and all. And I have one of the first television sets in Rose Lane. I hope it won't hurt your feelings. And as you know, whatever people may say about me, certainly I'm one of the first to believe in keeping up the old traditions, just as poor dear old F. Swan was. But at the same time, it seems to me that the old home here is a little on the dreary and old fashioned side. Of course, I never could persuade the Potter to bring it up to date, but anyway, I want Davy and you to come live with us in Worcester immediately. As for you, Sissy, you will of course understand that you are entirely welcome, but perhaps you would prefer to do something livelier, such as joining the Women's Corpo Auxiliary. He was, Sissy raged, so damned kind to everybody. She couldn't even stir herself to insult him much. She earnestly desired to, when she found that he had brought David an uniform, and when David put it on and paraded about shouting, like most of the boys he played with, "Hail, Windrip!" Oh, Jesus. She telephoned to Lorinda Pike at Beecher Falls and was able to tell Philip that she was going to help Lorinda in the tea room. Emma and David went off to Worcester. At the last moment, at the station, Emma decided to be pretty teary about it, though David begged her to remember that they had Uncle Philip's word for it, that Worcester was just the same as Boston, London, Hollywood, and a Wild West ranch put together. Sissy stayed to get the house rented. Mrs. Candy, who was going to open her bakery now and who never did inform the impractical Sissy whether or no she was being paid for these last weeks, made for Sissy all the foreign dishes that only Sissy and Doremus cared for, and they not uncheerfully dined together in the kitchen. So it was Shad's time to swoop. He came blusteringly calling on her in November. Never had she hated him quite so much, yet never so much feared him, because of what he might do to her father and Julian and Buck and the others in concentration camps. He grunted, "Well, your boyfriend Jewel, that thought he was so cute, the poor heel. We got all the dope on his double crossing us, all right. He'll never bother you again." "He's not so bad. Let's forget him. Shall I play you something on the piano?" "Sure. Shoot. I always did like high-class music," said the refined commissioner, lolling on a couch, putting his heels up on a damask chair. Damask? On a damask? Damask? On a damask chair in the room where once he had cleaned the fireplace. If it was his serious purpose to discourage Sissy in regard to that anti-corpo institution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, he was succeeding even better than Judge Philip Jessup. Sir William Gilbert would have said of Shad that he was so very, very proletarian. I don't know what that means. 30s comedy. Proletarian. Proletarian? I don't know. She had played for but 5 minutes when he forgot that he was now refined and bawled, "Oh, cut out the highbrow stuff. Come on and sit down." She stayed on the piano stool. Just what would she do if Shad became violent? There was no Julian to appear melodramatically at the nick of time and rescue her. Then she remembered Mrs. Candy in the kitchen and was content. "What the heck you snickering at?" said Shad. "Oh, I was just thinking about that story you told me about how Mr. Falk bleated when you arrested him." "Yeah, that was comical. Old Reverend certainly blatted like a goat." Could she kill him? Would it be wise to kill him? Had Mary meant to kill Swan? Would they be harder on Julian and her father if she killed Shad? Incidentally, did it hurt much to get hanged? He was yawning. "Well, sis, old kid, how about you and me taking a little trip to New York in a couple weeks? See some high life. I'll get you the best suit and the best hotel in town, and we'll take in some shows. I hear this Colin Stalin is a hot number, real corpo art. And I'll buy you some honest to God champagne wine. And then if we find we like each other enough, I'm willing for us, if you are, to get hitched." "But Shad, we could never live on your salary. I mean, I mean, of course, the corpos ought to pay you better. I mean, even better than they do. Listen, baby, I ain't going to have to get along on any miserable county commissioner's salary for the rest. Motherfucker. I ain't going to have to get along on any miserable county commissioner's salary the rest of my life. Believe me, I'm going to be a millionaire before very long. Then he told her precisely the sort of discreditable secret for which she had so long fished in vain. Perhaps it was because he was sober. Shad, when drunk, reversed all the rules and became more peasant like and cautious with each drink. He had a plan. That plan was as brutal and as infeasible as any plan of Shad Ledoux for making large money would be. Its essence was that he should avoid manual labor and should make as many persons miserable as possible. It was like his plan when he was still a hired man to become wealthy by breeding dogs, first stealing the dogs and preferably the kennels. As county commissioner, he had not merely, as was the corpo custom, been bribed by the shopkeepers and professional men for protection against the MMs. He had actually gone into partnership with them, promising them larger orders, and he boasted he had secret contracts with these merchants, all written down and signed and tucked away in his office safe. Sissy got rid of him that evening by being difficult, while letting him assume that the conquest of her would not take more than 3 or 4 days. She cried furiously after he had gone, in the comforting presence of Mrs. Candy, who first put away a butcher knife with which Sissy suspected she had been standing ready all evening. Mrs. Candy, she's a hero. I love it. I hope she gets to whack somebody. Will it be Chekhov's butcher knife? Next morning, Sissy drove to Hanover and shamelessly tattled to Francis Tasbro about the interesting documents Shad had in his safe. She did not ever see Shad Ledoux again. She was very sick about his being killed. She was very sick about all killing. She found no heroism, but only barbaric bestiality in having to kill so that one might so far live as to be halfway honest and kind and secure. But she knew that she would be willing to do it again. The Jessup house was magniloquently rented by that noble Roman, that political belch, ex-governor Isham Hubbard, who, being tired of again trying to make a living by peddling real estate and criminal law, was pleased to accept the appointment as successor to Shad Ledoux. Sissy hastened to Beecher Falls and to Lorinda Pike. Father Parafix took charge of the NU's cell, merely saying, as he had said daily since Buzz Windrip had been inaugurated, that he was fed up with the whole business and was immediately going back to Canada. In fact, on his desk he had a Canadian timetable. It was now 2 years old. Sissy was in too snappish a state to stand being mothered, being fattened and sobbed over and brightly sent to bed. Mrs. Candy had done only too much of that. and Philip had given her all the parental advice she could endure for a while. It was a relief when Lorinda received her as an adult, as one too sensible to insult by pity, received her, in fact, with as much respect as if she were an enemy and not a friend. After dinner, in Lorinda's new tea room, in an aged house which was now empty of guests for the winter, except for the constant infestation of whimpering refugees, Lorinda, knitting, made her first mention of the dead Mary. I suppose your sister did intend to kill Swan, eh? I don't know. The Corpos didn't seem to think so. They gave her a big military funeral. Well, of course, they don't care much to have assassinations talked about and maybe sort of become a general habit. I agree with your father. I think that, in many cases, assassinations are really rather unfortunate, a mistake in tactics. No, not good. Oh, by the way, Sissy, I think I'm going to get your father out of concentration camp. What? Lorinda had none of the matrimony. Lorinda had none of the matrimonial moans of Emma. She was as businesslike as ordering eggs. Yes, I tried everything. I went to see Tasbro and that educational fellow, Peasley. Nothing doing. They want to keep Doremus in. But that rat, Eris Dilly, is at Trianon as guard now. I'm bribing him to help your father escape. We'll have the man here for Christmas, only kind of late, and sneak him into Canada. Oh, said Sissy. A few days afterward, reading a coded new underground telegram which apparently dealt with the delivery of furniture, Lorinda shrieked, Sissy, all you know what has busted loose in Washington. Lee Saracen has deposed Buzz Windrip and grabbed the dictatorship. Oh, said Sissy. Holy shit. Chapter 35. In his 2 years of dictatorship, Berzelius Windrip daily became more a miser of power. He continued to tell himself that his main ambition was to make all citizens healthy in purse and mind, and that if he was brutal, it was only toward fools and reactionaries who wanted the old clumsy systems. But after 18 months of presidency, he was angry that Mexico and Canada and South America, obviously his own property by manifest destiny, should curtly answer his curt diplomatic notes and show no helpfulness about becoming part of his inevitable empire. And daily he wanted louder, more convincing yeses from everybody about him. How could he carry on his heartbreaking labor if nobody ever encouraged him? He demanded. Anyone, from Saracen to interoffice messenger, who did not play valet to his ego, he suspected of plotting against him. He constantly increased his bodyguard and as constantly distrusted all his guards and discharged him, and once took a shot at a couple of them, so that in all the world he had no companion save his old aide Lee Saracen and perhaps Hector McGoblin, to whom he could talk easily. He felt lonely in the hours when he wanted to shuck off his duties of despotism along with his shoes and his fine new coat. He no longer went out racketing. His cabinet begged him not to clown in bar rooms and lodge entertainments. It was not dignified, and it was dangerous to be too near to strangers. So he played poker with his bodyguard late at night, and at such times drank too much, and he cursed them and glared with bulging eyes whenever he lost, which, for all the good will of his guards about letting him win, had to be often, because he pinched their salaries badly and locked up the spoons. He had become as unbouncing and unbuzzing a buzz as might be, and he did not know it. All the while, he loved the people just as much as he feared and detested persons, and he planned to do something historic. Certainly, he would give each family that $5,000 a year just as soon now as he could arrange it. And Lee Saracen, forever making his careful lists, as patient at his desk as he was pleasure hungry on the couch at midnight parties, was beguiling officials to consider him their real lord and the master of corpoism. He kept his promises to them, while Windrip always forgot. His office door became the door of ambition. In Washington, the reporters privily spoke of this assistant secretary and that general as Saracen men. His clique was not a government within a government, it was the government itself, minus the megaphones. He had the Secretary of Corporations, a former vice president of the American Federation of Labor, coming to him secretly every evening to report on labor politics and in especial on such proletarian leaders as were dissatisfied with Windrip as chief, i.e., with their own share in the swag. He had from the Secretary of the Treasurer, though this functionary, one Webster Skittle, was not a lieutenant of Saracen, but merely friendly, confidential reports on the affairs of those large employers who, since under corporalism, it was usually possible for a millionaire to persuade the judges in the labor arbitration courts to look at things reasonably, rejoiced that with strikes outlawed and employers regarded as state officials, they would now be in secure power forever. Saracen knew the quiet ways in which these reinforced industrial barons used arrests by the MMs to get rid of troublemakers, particularly per, particularly of Jewish radicals, a Jewish radical being a Jew with nobody working for him. Some of the barons were themselves Jews. It is not to be expected that race loyalty should be carried so insanely far as to weaken the pocketbook. The allegiance of all such Negroes as had the sense to be content with safety and good pay, instead of ridiculous yearnings for personal integrity, Saracen got by being photographed shaking hands with the celebrated Negro fundamentalist clergyman, the Reverend Dr. Alexander Nibbs, and through the highly publicized Saracen prizes for the Negroes, with the largest families, the fastest time in floor scrubbing, and the longest periods of work without taking a vacation. No danger of our good friends, the Negroes, turning red when they're encouraged like that, Saracen announced to the newspapers. It was a satisfaction to Saracen that in Germany All military bands were now playing his national song, Buzz and Buzz, along with the Horst Wessel hymn, for though he had not exactly written the music as well as the words, the music was now being attributed to him abroad. As a bank clerk might, quite rationally, worry equally over the whereabouts of $100 million worth of the bank's bonds and of 10 cents of his own lunch money, so Buzz Windrip worried equally over the welfare, that is, the obedience to himself, of 130 odd million American citizens, and the small matter of the moods of Lee Saracen, whose approval of him was the one real fame. His wife, Windrip, did not see oftener than once a week, and anyway, what that rustic wench thought was unimportant. Yikes. The diabolic Hector McGoblin frightened him. Secretary of Secretary of War Lou Thorne and Vice President Pearlie Beecroft he liked well enough, but they bored him. They smacked too much of his own small town boyhood, to escape which he was willing to take the responsibilities of a nation. It was the incalculable Lee Saracen on whom he depended, and the Lee with whom he had gone fishing and boozing and once even murdering, who had seemed his own self made more sure and articulate, had thoughts now which he could not penetrate. Lee's smile was a veil, not a revelation. It was to discipline Lee with the hope of bringing him back that when Buzz replaced the amiable but clumsy Colonel Luthorn as Secretary of War by Colonel Dewey Hake, Commissioner of the Northeastern Province, Buzz's characteristic comment was that Luthorn was not pulling his weight. He also gave to Hake the position of High Marshal of the MMs, which Lee had held along with a dozen other offices. From Lee, he expected an explosion, then repentance, and a new friendship. But Lee only said, "Very well, if you wish," and said it coldly. Just how could he get Lee to be a good boy and come play with him again? Wistfully wondered the man who now and then planned to be emperor of the world. He gave Lee $1,000 television set. Even more coldly did Lee thank him, and never spoke afterward of how well he might be receiving the still shaky television broadcasts on his beautiful new set. As Dewey Hake took hold, doubling efficiency in both the regular army and the Minutemen, he was a demon for all-night practice marches in heavy order, and the files could not complain because he set the example. Buzz began to wonder whether Hake might not be his new confidant. He really would hate to throw Lee into prison, but still, Lee was so thoughtless about hurting his feelings when he'd gone and done so much for him and all. Buzz was confused. He was the more confused when Pearlie Beecroft came in and briefly said that he was sick of all this bloodshed and was going home to the farm. And as for his lofty vice presidential office, Buzz knew what he could do with it. Were these vast national dissensions no different from squabbles in his father's drugstore? Fretted Buzz. He couldn't very well have Beecroft shot. It might cause criticism, but it was indecent. It was sacrilegious to annoy an emperor. And in his irritation, he had an ex senator and 12 workmen who were in concentration camps taken out and shot on the charge that they had told irreverent stories about him. Secretary of State Saracen was saying good night to President Windrip in the hotel suite where Windrip really lived. No newspaper had dared mention it, but Buzz was both bothered by the stateliness of the White House and frightened by the number of Reds and cranks and anti corpos who, with the most commendable patience and ingenuity, tried to sneak into that historic mansion and murder him. Buzz merely left his wife there for show and, except at great receptions, never entered any part of the White House save the office annex. He liked this hotel suite. He was a sensible man who preferred straight bourbon, codfish cakes, and deep leather chairs to burgundy, trout bleu, and Louis cans. In this 12-room apartment occupying the entire 10th floor of a small, unnotorious hotel, he had for himself only a plain bedroom, a huge living room which looked like a combination of office and hotel lobby, a large liquor closet, another closet with 37 suits of clothes, and a bathroom with jars and jars of the pine-flavored bath salts, which were his only cosmetic luxury. Buzz might come home in a suit dazzling as a horse blanket, one considered in Alfalfa Center a triumph of London tailoring, but once safe, he liked to put on his red Morocco slippers that were down at the heel and display his red suspenders and baby blue sleeve garters. To feel correct in those decorations, he preferred the hotel atmosphere that, for so many years before he had ever seen the White House, had been as familiar to him as his ancestral corn cribs and main streets. The other 10 rooms of the suite, entirely shutting his own off from the corridors and elevators, were filled night and day with guards. To get through to Buzz in this intimate place of his own was very much like visiting a police station for the purpose of seeing a homicidal prisoner. Hake seems to me to be doing a fine job in the War Department, Lee, said the president. Of course, if you ever want the job of High Marshal back. I'm quite satisfied, said the great Secretary of State. What do you think of having Colonel Luthorn back to help Hake out? He's pretty good on fool details. Saracen looked as nearly embarrassed as the self-satisfied Lee Saracen ever could look. Why, I suppose you knew it. Luthorn was liquidated in the purge 10 days ago. Good God! Luthorn killed? Why didn't I know it? It was thought better to keep it quiet. He was a pretty popular man, but dangerous, always talking about Abraham Lincoln. So I just never know anything about what's going on? Why, even the newspaper clippings are pre-digested, by God, before I see them. It's thought better not to bother you with minor details, boss. You know that. Of course, if you feel I haven't organized your staff correctly. Now, don't fly off the handle, Lee. I just meant Of course, I know how hard you've tried to protect me so I could give all my brains to the higher problems of state. But Luthorn, I kind of liked him. He always had quite a funny line when we played poker. Buzz Windrip felt lonely, as once a certain Shad Ledoux had felt, in a hotel suite that differed from Buzz's only in being smaller. To forget it, he bawled very brightly. Lee, do you ever wonder what'll happen in the future? Why, I think you and I may have mentioned it. But golly, just think of what might happen in the future, Lee. Think of it. Why, we may be able to pull off a North American kingdom. Buzz half meant it seriously, or perhaps quarter meant it. How'd you like to be Duke of Georgia, or Grand Duke, or whatever they call a grand exalted ruler of the Elks in this peerage business? And then how about an empire of North and South America after that? I might make you a king under me then. Say something like King of Mexico. How'd you like that? Be very amusing, said Lee mechanically, as Lee always did say the same thing mechanically whenever Buzz repeated this same nonsense. But you get to stick by me. But you get to stick by me and not forget all I've done for you, Lee. Don't forget that. I never forget anything. By the way, we ought to liquidate, or at least imprison, Pearlie Beecroft, too. He's still technically Vice President of the United States, and if the lousy traitor managed some skullduggery so as to get you killed or deposed, he might be regarded by some narrow-minded literalists as president. No, no, no! He's my friend, no matter what he says about me. The dirty dog, wailed Buzz. All right, you're the boss. All right, you're the boss. Good night, said Lee, and returned from this plumber's dream of paradise to his own gold and black and apricot silk bower in Georgetown, which he shared with several handsome young officers. They were savage soldiers, yet apt at music and at poetry. With them he was not in the least passionless, as he seemed now to Buzz Windrip. He was either angry with his young friends, and then he whipped them, or he was in a paroxysm of apology to them and caressed their wounds. Newspaper men who had once seemed to be his friends said that he had traded the green eye shade for a wreath of violets. Well, in 1935, I guess that was a pretty harsh critique of a leader. Earlier, we had the stereotypical gay punching bag bad guy, and here we have the patrician, the J. Edgar Hoover, if you will, who may or may not like men sexually, but definitely has something weird going on. So, whatever. 30s comedy, 30s literature. At cabinet meeting, late in 1938, Secretary of State Saracen revealed to the heads of the government disturbing news. Vice President Beecroft, and had he not told them the man should have been shot, had fled to Canada, renounced corpoism, and joined Walt Trowbridge in plotting. There were bubbles from an almost boiling rebellion in the Middle West and Northwest, especially in Minnesota and the Dakotas, where agitators Some of them formerly of political influence were demanding that their states cede from the Corpo Union and form a cooperative, indeed almost socialistic, commonwealth of their own. Rats! Just a lot of irresponsible windbags, jeered President Windrip. Why, I thought you were supposed to be the camera-eyed gink that kept up on everything that goes on, Lee. You forget that I myself, personally, made a special radio address to that particular section of the country last week, and I got a wonderful reaction. The Middle Westerners are absolutely loyal to me. They appreciate what I've been trying to do. Not answering him at all, Saracen demanded that, in order to bring and hold all elements in the country together by that useful patriotism which always appears upon threat of an outside attack, the government immediately arranged to be insulted and menaced in a well-planned series of deplorable incidents on the Mexican border and declare war on Mexico as soon as America showed that it was getting hot and patriotic enough. Secretary of the Treasury Skittle and Attorney General Porkwood shook their heads, but Secretary of War Hake and Secretary of Education McGoblin agreed with Saracen high-mindedly. Once, pointed out the learned McGoblin, governments had merely let themselves slide into a war, thanking Providence for having provided a conflict as a febrifuge against internal discontent. But of course, in this age of deliberate, planned propaganda, a really modern government like theirs must figure out what brand of war they had to sell and plan the selling campaign consciously. Now, as for him, he would be willing to leave the whole setup to the advertising genius of Brother Saracen. All right. There's a fun movie where they try to do this to Canada. Michael Moore is in it. Alan Alda. I can't remember the name right now. Oh, Wag the Dog. It's even become like a saying, wag the dog, come up with a pretense for starting a war or whatever. And in my upbringing, my first exposure to it was President George H.W. Bush, who basically wagged the dog on Iraq. He basically like gave his blessing to Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. And then they whipped up all this propaganda, like fake video and stuff. And one of the videos was of, think about this in the age of like, could a deep fake happen? Like, this is what we did. Like a Kuwaiti princess basically stood in a room with a bunch of incubators and said they're taking out the incubators and like throwing babies on the ground or whatever. Like, and then sure enough, we went and invaded Kuwait, you know. So that was fun. Some people would say that every war is done this way. Vietnam, Gulf of Tonkin incident ramped it up. Or Tonkin, Gulf of Tonkin. I'm not sure. But anyway, they that was a whole thing. The exploding of the Lusitania before World War I. Lusitania. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce these things properly. I should just go with it and not even suggest an alternative. I'll just buzz Windrip it. Anyway, it still happens to this day. The bombing of Kosovo was pretty much just a colossal scam. They ended up blowing up an aspirin plant that made all kinds of cheap drugs for their citizens, generic drugs and stuff. They did it in the Sudan. They blew up an aspirin clinic, like a building that made all these medicines and claimed it was to destroy anthrax or some bullshit. Um, yeah, it's bad. It's ugh, God. Not that people weren't doing ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. I want to make that clear, but I mean the selling of it like was whipped up real quick, and then what they did with it was real fucked up. Um anyway. No, 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 cried Windrip. We're not ready for a war. Of course, we'll take Mexico someday. It's our destiny to control it and Christianize it. It's our destiny to control it and Christianize it. But I'm scared that your darn scheme might work just opposite to what you say. You put arms into the hands of too many irresponsible folks, and they might use them and turn against you and start a revolution and throw the whole darn gang of us out. Oh, no. I've often wondered if the whole Minutemen business, with their arms and training, may not be a mistake. That was your idea, Lee, not mine. Saracen spoke evenly. My dear Buzz, one day you thank me for originating that great crusade of citizen soldiers defending their homes, as you love to call it on the radio, and the next day you almost ruin your clothes. You're so scared of them. Make up your mind one way or the other. Saracen walked out of the room, not bowing. Windrip complained, I'm not going to stand for Lee's talking to me like that. Why, the dirty double-crosser, I made him. One of these days he'll find a new Secretary of State around this joint. I suppose he thinks jobs like that grow on every tree. Maybe he'd like to be a bank president or something. I mean, maybe he'd like to be Emperor of England. President Windrip, in his hotel bedroom, was awakened late at night by the voice of a guard in the outer room. Yeah, sure. Let him pass. He's the Secretary of State. Nervously, the president clicked on his bedside lamp. He had needed it lately to read himself to sleep. In that limited glow, he saw Lee Saracen, Dewey Hake, and Dr. Hector McGoblin march to the side of his bed. Lee's thin, sharp face was like flour. His deep, buried eyes were those of a sleepwalker. His skinny right hand held a Bowie knife, which, as his hand deliberately rose, was lost in the dimness. Windrip swiftly thought, sure would be hard to know where to buy a dagger in Washington. And Windrip thought, all this is the doggone all this is the doggondest foolishness, just like a movie or one of these old history books when you were a kid. And Windrip thought, all in that same flash, good God, I'm going to be killed! He cried out, Lee, you couldn't do that to me. Lee grunted, like one who has detected a bad smell. Then the Berzelius Windrip, who could incredibly become president, really awoke. Lee, do you remember the time when your old mother was so sick and I gave you my last cent and loaned you my flivver so you could go see her? And I hitchhiked to my next meeting? Lee. Hell, I suppose so. General? Yes, answered Dewey Hake, not very pleasantly. I think we'll stick him on a destroyer or something and let him sneak off to France or England. The lousy coward seems afraid to die. Of course, we'll kill him if he ever does dare to come back to the States. Take him out and phone the Secretary of Navy for a boat. Get him on it, will you? Very well, sir, said Hake, even less pleasantly. It had been easy. The troops who obe- the troops who obeyed Hake as Secretary of War had occupied all of Washington. 10 days later, Buzz Windrip was landed in Havre and went sighingly to Paris. It was his first view of Europe, except for one 21-day Cook's tour. He was profoundly homesick for Chesterfield cigarettes, flapjacks, moon mullins, and the sound of some real human being saying, "Yeah, what's biting you?" instead of this perpetual sappy we. Or I should say, instead of this perpetual sappy we. In Paris he remained, though he became the sort of minor hero of tragedy, like the ex-king of Greece, Kerensky, the Russian Grand Dukes, Jimmy Walker, and a few ex-presidents from South America and Cuba, who is delighted to accept invitations to drawing rooms where the champagne is good enough and one may have a chance of finding people now and then who will listen to one's story and say, "Sir." At that, though, Buzz chuckled. He had kind of put it over on those crooks, for during his 2 sweet years of despotism, he had sent $4 million abroad to secret safe accounts. And so Buzz Windrip passed into wobbly paragraphs in recollections by ex-diplomatic gentlemen with monocles. In what remained of ex-President Windrip's life, everything was X. He was even so far forgotten that only 4 or 5 American students tried to shoot him. Sounds like Trump. The more dulcetly they had once advised and flattered Buzz, the more ardently did most of his former followers, McGoblin and Senator Porkwood and Dr. Almeric Trout and the rest, turn in loud allegiance to the new president, the Honorable Lee Saracen. He issued a proclamation that he had discovered that Windrip had been embezzling the people's money and plotting with Mexico to avoid war with that guilty country, and that he, Saracen, in quite alarming grief and reluctance, since he more than anyone else had been deceived by his supposed friend Windrip, had yielded to the urging of the cabinet and taken over the presidency instead of Vice President Beecroft, the exiled traitor. President Saracen immediately began appointing the fancier of his young officer friends to the most responsible offices in state and army. It amused him, seemingly, to shock people by making a pink-cheeked, moist-eyed boy of 25 commissioner of the federal district, which included Washington and Maryland. Was he not supreme? Was he not semi-divine like a Roman emperor? Could he not defy all the muddy mob that he, once a socialist, had, for its weak shiftlessness, come to despise? Would that the American people had just one neck, he plagiarized among his laughing boys. In the decorous White House of Coolidge and Harrison and Rutherford Bircher Hayes, he had orgies, an old name for parties, with weaving limbs and garlands and wine in pretty fair imitations of Roman beakers. It was hard for imprisoned men like Doremus Jessup to believe it, But there were some tens of thousands of corpos in the MMs, in civil service, in the army, and just in private ways to whom Saracen's flippant regime was tragic. They were the idealists of corpoism, and there were plenty of them, along with the bullies and swindlers. They were the men and women who, in 1935 and 1936, had turned to Windrip and Co. not as perfect, but as the most probable saviors of the country from, on one hand, domination by Moscow, and, on the other hand, the slack indolence, the lack of decent pride of half the American youth, whose world, these idealists asserted, was composed of shiftless distaste for work and refusal to learn anything thoroughly, of blatting dance music on the radio, maniac automobiles, slobbering sexuality, the humor and art of comic strips, of a slave psychology which was making America a land for sterner men to loot. General Emmanuel Kuhn was one of the corpo idealists. Such men did not condone the murders under the corpo regime, but they insisted this is a revolution, and after all, when in all history has there been a revolution with so little bloodshed? They were aroused by the pageantry of corpoism, enormous demonstrations with the red and black flags of flaunting magnificence like storm clouds. They were proud of new corpo roads, hospitals, television stations, aeroplane lines. They were touched by processions of the corpo youth. They were touched by processions of the corpo youth, whose faces were exalted with pride in the myths of corpo heroism and clean Spartan strength, and the semi-divinity of the all-protecting father, President Windrip. They made themselves believe that in Windrip had come alive again the virtues of Andy Jackson and Farragut and Jeb Stuart, in place of the mob cheapness of the professional athletes who had been the only heroes of 1935. They planned, these idealists, to correct, as quickly as might be, the errors of brutality and crookedness among officials. They saw arising a corpo art, a corpo learning, profound and real, divested of the traditional snobbishness of the old-time universities, valiant with youth, and only the more beautiful in that it was useful. They were convinced that corpoism was communism cleansed of foreign domination and the violence and indignity of mob dictatorship, monarchism with the chosen hero of the people for monarch, fascism without grasping and selfish leaders, freedom with order and discipline, traditional America without its waste and provincial cockiness. Like all religious zealots, they had blessed capacity for blindness, and they were presently convinced that, since the only newspapers they ever read certainly said nothing about it, there were no more of blood-smeared cruelties in court and concentration camp, no restrictions of speech or thought. They believed that they never criticized the corpo regime, not because they were censored, but because, quote, that sort of thing was, like obscenity, such awfully bad form. And these idealists were as shocked and bewildered by Saracen's coup d'etat against Windrip as was Mr. Berzelius Windrip himself. The grim Secretary of War, Hake, scolded at President Saracen for his influence on the nation, particularly on the troops. Lee laughed at him, but once he was sufficiently flattered by Hake's tribute to his artistic powers to write a poem for him. It was a poem which was later to be sung by millions. It was, in fact, the most popular of the soldiers' ballads, which were to spring automatically from anonymous soldier bards during the war between the United States and Mexico. Only, being as pious a believer in modern advertising as Saracen himself, the efficient Hake wanted to encourage the spontaneous generation of these patriotic folk ballads by providing the automatic springing and the anonymous bard. He had as much foresight, as much prophetic engineering as a motor car manufacturer. I don't know if that's is this ironic? Again, 30s comedy. I don't know what the hell's going on. Saracen was as eager for war. Saracen was as eager for war with Mexico or Ethiopia or Siam or Greenland or any other country that would provide his pet young painters with a chance to portray Saracen being heroic amid curious vegetation as Hake, not only to give malcontents something outside the country to be cross about, but also to give himself a chance to be picturesque. He answered Hake's request by writing a rollicking military chorus at a time while the country was still theoretically entirely friendly with Mexico. It went to the tune of Mademoiselle from Armentières or Armentiers. If the Spanish in it was a little shaky, still millions were later to understand that habla u stood for habla usted, signifying parlez-vous. It ran thus as it came from Saracen's purple but smoking typewriter. Senorita from Guadalupe, qui usted? Senorita, go roll your hoop or come to bed. Senorita from Guadalupe, if Padre sees us, we're in the soup. Hinky dinky, habla oo. Senorita from Monterey, savvy yank? Senorita, what's that you say? You're Swede, eh, tank? But Senorita from Monterey, you won't hablar when we hit the hay. Hinky dinky, habla oo. Senorita from Mazatlan, once we've met, you'll smile all over your khaki pan. You won't forget. For days you'll holler, oh, what a man! And you'll never marry a Mexican. Inky dinky, habla oo. If at times President Saracen seemed flippant, he was not at all so during his part in the scientific preparation for war, which consisted in rehearsing choruses, in trolling out this ditty with well-trained spontaneity. His friend, Hector McGoblin, now Secretary of State, told Saracen that this manly chorus was one of his greatest creations. McGoblin, though personally he did not join in Saracen's somewhat unusual midnight diversions, was amused by them, and he often told Saracen that he was the only original creative genius among this whole bunch of stuffed shirts, including Hake.
You want to watch that cuss, Hake, Lee,
said McGoblin.
He's ambitious, he's a gorilla, and he's a pious Puritan. And that's a triple combination I'm scared of. The troops like him.
Rats. He has no attraction for them. He's just an accurate military bookkeeper, said Saracen. That night, he had a party at which, for a novelty, rather shocking to his intimates, he actually had girls present, performing certain curious dances. The next morning, Hake rebuked him, and Saracen had a hangover, was stormed at. That night, just a month after Saracen had usurped the presidency, Hake struck. There was no melodramatic dagger and uplifted arm business about it this time, though Hake did traditionally come late, for all fascists, like all drunkards, seem to function most vigorously at night. Hake marched into the White House with his picked stormtroops, found President Saracen in violet silk pajamas among his friends, shot Saracen and most of his companions dead, and proclaimed himself president. Hector McGoblin fled by aeroplane to Cuba, then on. When last seen, he was living high up in the mountains of Haiti, wearing only a singlet, dirty white drill trousers, grass sandals, and a long tan beard, very healthy and happy, occupying a one-room hut with a lovely native girl, practicing modern medicine and studying ancient voodoo. When Dewey Hake became president, then America really did begin to suffer a little and to long for the good old democratic liberal days of Windrip. Windrip and Saracen had not minded mirth and dancing in the street so long as they could be suitably taxed. Hake disliked such things on principle. Except perhaps that he was an atheist in theology, he was a strict Orthodox Christian. He was the first to tell the populace that they were not going to get any $5,000 a year, but instead reap the profits of discipline and of the scientific totalitarian state, not in mere paper figures, but in vast dividends of pride, patriotism, and power. He kicked out of the army all officers who could not endure marching and going thirsty, and out of the civil branch all commissioners, including one Francis Tasbro, who had garnered riches too easily and too obviously. He treated the entire nation like a well-run plantation, on which the slaves were better fed than formerly, less often cheated by their overseers, and kept so busy that they had time only for work and for sleep, and thus fell rarely into the debilitating vices of laughter, song, except war songs against Mexico, complaint, or thinking. Under Hake, there were less flogging in posts and in concentration camps, for by his direction, officers were not to waste time in the sport of beating persons, men, women, or children, who asserted that they didn't care to be slaves on even the best plantation, but just to shoot them out of hand. Hake made such use of the clergy, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and liberal agnostic, as Windrip and Saracen never had. While there were plenty of ministers who, like Mr. Falk and Father Stephen Parafix, like Cardinal Faulhaber and Pastor Niemöller in Germany, considered it some part of Christian duty to resent the enslavement and torture of their appointed flocks, there were also plenty of reverend celebrities, particularly large city pastors, whose sermons were reported in the newspapers every Monday morning, to whom corpoism had given a chance to be noisily and lucratively patriotic. These were the chaplains at heart, who, if there was no war in which they could humbly help to purify and comfort the poor brave boys who were fighting, were glad to help provide such a war. These were more practical shepherds, since, like doctors and lawyers, they were able to steal secrets out of the heart, became valued spies during the difficult months after February 1939, when Hake was working up war with Mexico. Canada? Japan? Russia? They would come later. For even with an army of slaves, it was necessary to persuade them that they were free men and fighters for the principle of freedom, or otherwise the scoundrels might cross over and join the enemy. So reigned the good King Hake, and if there was anyone in all the land who was discontented, you never heard him speak, not twice. And in the White House, where under Saracen shameless youths had danced, under the new reign of righteousness and the blackjack, Mrs. Hake, a lady with eyeglasses and a smile of resolute cordiality, a lady with eyeglasses and a smile of resolute cordiality, gave to the WCTU, the YWCA, and the Ladies' League Against Red Radicalism, and their inherently incidental husbands, a magnified and hand-colored Washington version of just such parties as she had once given in the Hake Bungalow in Eglantine, Oregon. Weirdest cliffhanger in this book so far. There's a lady. Oh my God. There's a lot here. I haven't said as much this time. That song, I didn't know how to sing that song. Apologies. It was terrible. Saracen should have been shot for that shit. It's awful. So bad. Man. Yeah, he's just doing it up like he's showing us different forms of fascism now. I like that. This is like Pinochet, this motherfucker. Well, that's probably enough. I think there's 3 chapters left, 36, 37, 38. That's it. That's all she wrote. So yeah, I'll probably do those 3 chapters next time. Stick around, stay tuned. Once again, if you want to share your work, I could talk about it on here or on my show. Everything is awesome. If you want to recommend a guest, just have a banter back and forth with me, recommend a co-host, anything, shoot me a tweet at EIA Podcast. Come to our Facebook page, Everything is Awesome, or Friends of Everything is Awesome is our Facebook group. Send us an email, everythingisawesomepodcast@gmail.com. And I've got tons of other shows, all kinds of shit going on. Check us out at Sinister Parent Company on Twitter at Sin Parent Co. So many good shows straight off the top of my headlines. Something Wonderful Right Away. Good Idea. There's some more. I've got 7 of them. Anyway, I'll see you guys real soon. Take care. Much love. Peace.